Hello everyone, today we talk about a huge topic that blends very well with other videos we made, especially about Merovingian history, and that here we will see is basically a fulfillment of regarding, in fact, what had been initially presaged by Clovis's victory in Gaul and later fulfilled by Charlemagne's triumph in Italy. This topic ties well with a huge array of topics that we have covered, in particular with certain videos that gained a very important traction among my following and the algorithm, encompassing mostly the relation between the western and the eastern halves of the Roman Empire. So what I truly mean also by Roman, in this case we will have ample opportunity to review. I know that many of you sort of are new by this point. They haven't followed Schwerpunkt in the previous years, and sometimes I have to revive a bit the awareness of my historical acknowledgement regarding this quite crucial topic that, in fact, also involves, first of all, the relation between the Latin-Germanic and the Greco-Byzantine world, as much as in this sense, the broader outcome of the migration era, which is a topic in particular that I've seen unavoidably taking shape during my, again, pretty relentless video making on the entirety of the Middle Ages. Sometimes we stop essentially to the migration era. We say, especially from a Western perspective, like the last big migration is the Longobard one. Things are more or less settled. Yes, there are, the Avars infiltrating in Germany, but not so much going on in the meanwhile. In the East, things are rougher. And yet, the second topic gets a bit more smoothened by the fact that, again, this is just like late antiquity ending, right? So what happens later is something else. For us Westerners, it's a big deal to emphasize this aspect because from one side, we either were orphaned, at least of perceived, allegedly orphaned of a Roman identity and empire in the West. My vision is that we unfairly pushed this to the point of claiming that basically there was no Roman Empire after the fall of the West and its last sort of chunks, the administrative western half of the Roman Empire, and so betraying, first of all, the concept of the Imperium, that, as we will see for today's video, is actually crucial, and it was, at the time, much more than we intend. The same metaphysical ethnicity of Romanity and what this would mean not just for Charlemagne, but especially for dynasties like the Ottonians that later on properly embraced the such Roman identity, right, at all levels. In fact, at a perennial heavenly one for the Western Empire. And some people, in fact, don't even attribute much of a Romanity to the Western Empire to begin with, to the Holy Roman Empire, and this, again, can happen for different reasons. There are people that have been post-traditionally driven, mostly in nationalistic terms, mostly, in fact, from a socialistic side was mostly an atheistic perspective, the fact that, the church, the Christianization of Europe was somehow allegedly bad, and or at least what happened in the aftermath of the Roman Empire can't be defined as something more splendid than what had been, and or in continuity with that tradition, because by recognizing that, you should recognize the Catholic universal, in fact, roots of not just the empire, but in fact of the transcendence of Roman ethnicity having been achieved, like during what we conventionally intend as the empire itself. From a nationalistic point of view, in terms like, just to make an example, the Italians saying, okay, first we had an empire, then the barbarians came allegedly, because, again, there's also so many topics we made about this, and so we don't recognize whatever it was compared to the classical Romanity. at other, I don't know, Germanic level, Northern European one. At some point, the Roman Empire not having even ever existed in some lands, or where the Germans had taken over certain parts of the West. This was the destruction of the terrible Romans that had conquered and oppressed the people who came back to be free. Yeah, because we all know that Germanic society, yet by the 6th century, was so free and not fully in line with, in fact, the Romano-Germanic aristocratic role that was the only one attainable in order to rule the Western, that is to say, civilized parts of Europe. For what this, in fact, Occidentalis parts was concerned. So it turns out that many people, especially when first presented with these ideas, tend to go like in all different directions, like billiard balls, completely oblivious of what the most important concept properly intended by those peoples at the time was about. All right, today I will try not to digress once again on what was the traditional Catholic nature of the empire, even before Christianity, which I always like now to insert as a provocation, and I fully mean it, because again there is a very specifically theological and religious, straightforwardly formal and official point to that unfortunately has not been taught to us in schools, about how in fact not just the Roman Empire, but the great universal empires of antiquity were properly believed to be. Then there is the huge issue of the Imperial East, and so the Byzantine half that many people still stop to. They weren't called Byzantines; they were called Romans. As if, by the way, anyone who used the term Byzantine, including Byzantinists, didn't actually say that we're actually also Roman at the same time. So completely outside of any historiographical, scholarly, academic reference whatsoever. Again, it's mostly fighting against generations that have been raised in the last decades without any traceable evidence of of any moral or scientific education whatsoever, let alone higher culture and a historical competence, which seems to be possibly the lowest point of our learning system. And I don't put in here the sort of the schooling, like the academic side of the story. Nevertheless, today we'll stick mostly to what we have already uploaded with hundreds of videos. So if any of you feels, I don't know, emotionally hurt by my words and think that I'm some kind of, non-professional, heretic, or most heretical academic or whatever, it's not my problem. Just enjoy moral disorder. When we look at medieval Europe, we also tend to make a somehow great confusion between the concepts of power and the concept of, say, formal political territorial dominations. All right, I have come on Schwerpunkt to cover different videos, either Q&As or commenting on other channels' work, discussing things like, I don't know, why was this country so fragmented in the Middle Ages, or why was medieval Europe so politically disunited, and what's the deal with that? Were they weak? How does it work? Aside from, of course, the necessary fundamentals in order to understand medieval politics and society. I mean, if you think that medieval powers can be measured through the standards of 19th century nation states, of course, it's a bit difficult, even just in practical, public, institutional, administrative, governmental fashion. I've met with students, I've met with even with people with a degree, etc., that had a severe problem as contemporary, but also contemporary historians, for example, to understand how actually power worked in the centuries, which is not even substantially different from the later one. It was just sort of in a more primitive form, but following still, by some degree, some pattern of centralization, some pattern of actual direct territorial control, and more, it's like when people ask, why were medieval armies so small? And it turns out that they weren't even that small, or why were so many sieges in the Middle Ages? And it's not like the modern age actually witnessed before, especially the 18th century, that less siege warfare. Nor for antiquity, this can be discussed. So if you're interested in all these topics, just know that, of course, I've covered them all. I'm creating many more playlists to sort of try to meet your curiosity criteria, trying to imagine, to foresee what kind of key you would insert to search what on YouTube, etc. It's perhaps not incredibly successful because it doesn't seem like making more playlists necessarily brings more views per se. But surely that helps for especially those that follow me on a regular basis. So there is a lot to unpack in here. But the concept is quite straightforward, and it has to do with, yes, Frankish history, but also European history. Every government reflects the decisive moral majority of the population, which because of the unfortunate democratic superstition that most people live in, equates to, okay, so the majority of the people. No, not the majority of the people. People are not equal, right? Nor they express their ideas, their morals, their actions, their will in the same way. We're talking the decisive moral majority of the population, right? Which is also the reason why, for example, in totalitarian regime, people are weaker. Human beings are less valuable, and as such, it takes just a minimal moral quantity in absolute terms to run them, right? It has nothing to do with perceived weakness, just like, I don't know, propaganda would like to make you believe about, look, Europe is so divided, so weak. Yeah, as if, we could do without the EU out there, regardless of whichever political inclination you may have. You know that I'm beyond ultra-far right-wing, so it's something that takes off completely, that not even conservatives really have any clue of what it can be. So don't worry, you are in good company. These are not simple teasers. They're important because if we are not on the same page, you can't properly get where I'm going to get with this video. Right, and the point of the Franks and the Europeans in that sense, or at least the Western Europeans, or also a broader array of Europeans, because the Carolingian Empire, of course, encompasses also Central Europe in great part, and especially becomes hegemonic in that direction. For not talking, we will stop fundamentally to the Carolingians today. We will talk about the aftermath of that and how that influenced later, for example, the Teutonic Empire that we already mentioned, etc. Right, but when we look at these powers, we're not looking at some sort of dirigistic, autocratic, self-referential, and self-entitled power that all of a sudden took over the majority of Europe. Also, in a broader, remember that, like, power does not stop to what you directly control in a territorial sense. That's the same reason why the Roman Empire de facto controlled so far into northern, central, eastern Europe, and beyond, of course. And we tend sort of to stop to the limits rather than to material limits, especially, but unfortunate philosophical influences there. But also to that kind of determinism and lack, especially of responsibility analysis regarding how and why certain powers rose and fell. It's evident that Europe at large was much more powerful in the 13th century than it was at the time of Charlemagne, right? So you cannot say that, for example, political fragmentation simply equates to some greater weakness in the sum, at least, of all the various chunks. This is in part the same for early medieval Europe. Of course, a unitary project that succeeds in its intent is a greater deal. It's a bigger success. You can and must, of course, and especially when it comes to Western history, realize what kind of striking ethnocultural homogeneity existed in a broader sense, especially at this point in European history. All right, Charlemagne is often called the father of Europe, but obviously enough, he would have not been able to accomplish what he did hadn't there been a Roman Empire, hadn't there been Indo-European migrations, hadn't there been that, in fact, broader traditional Catholic background to such Western, in fact, grandeur pioneering, right, in world dominance, right? Universal dominance. Naturally, when we look at the early Middle Ages, we're looking at systems that are pretty much struggling in many ways. This is true for the Latin-Germanic one, but it is true for the Byzantine one. We know it that well. The same caliphate basically explodes and then literally crumbles, in fact, as the consequence of a conflagration, as it basically generates different states that are also mostly functioning on the basis of previous civilization that have nothing to do with the Arabs, for example. And there is no doubt that there is a great success also in there, so much so that we call Arab certain countries like, I don't know, North Africa or others that really have nothing to do ethnogenetically with the Arabian Peninsula at large, but that somehow witnessed that kind of cultural mark. It's a bit like, and in a much more deeply engineered and successful fashion, the Romans, right, or later also the Carolingians through their feudalism and beyond, literally established a Romance world in actually much more far and wide than the Germans would be later capable of expanding from northern Europe towards essentially the center in the west. And in fact, in establishing Gaul, Italy in particular, but also other countries in relative terms as the most successful countries in the history of mankind, given their sheer magnitude of civilizational impact on the whole world that is to this day essentially a European world. I mean, there is no country in the world nowadays that it emerges simply in a broader civilizational sense from something that is not Western in nature, and therefore stemming from that kind of background. And I love this to be contentious because I know what most people tend to believe, especially in a world that is increasingly globalized and where also, countries that up to the last minute we consider third world are somehow, acceptably, communicating with the rest, unfortunately, and also for the rest of the world, kind of scarce quality, and they are actually collapsing in much greater ways than that the West had actually even had in plan to do. As we maintain an astonishing control on our civilizational development. Aside from this, and this is mostly a European thing indeed, when you look at these backs and forths in medieval history, you can't pretend not to notice what the Carolingians accomplished. What the Carolingians accomplished at some point was also hyper-emphasized on the grounds of something particularly innovative. Right, and I recently made a video commenting on Kings and Generals' alleged debunking of the concept of feudalism, which, among the various things that did not talk about, because it didn't talk basically almost about anything, it did not address a crucial aspect, that is how much the Carolingian system owed specifically to the Merovingian one, to the point that we can't even see much of a difference, if not in an acceleration, in an intensification. Surely there is a form that the Carolingian Empire takes on, especially thanks to the papacy, the Roman imperial crowning, that meant maybe something you want to take in consideration when you make bad jokes about the Holy Roman Empire, referring to Voltaire et similia without having actually studied what the medieval civilization is. Many people is fundamentally still the Dark Ages with, ignorant Europeans that had to learn stuff from the Arabs, the Greeks, except they were the actual ones who from Europe already knew where to find books that weren't even read practically anymore in the East, picking them and using them just to give a theoretical clothing to what in terms of material, concrete, civilizational achievement like technology, but the same literature, same philosophy, etc., had surpassed these other peoples. In case you didn't notice, in 1204, Constantinople was conquered by these terrible brutes of the French and the Venetians that weren't exactly cavemen in the process. You have the Ruthenian Palatinate, that is to say the most advanced part of the Rus that converts to Greek Catholicism, right, with the Uniate Church, which is also at the root of for example, Ukrainian national identity. Made lots of videos about this. Most people have absolutely no clue about what that is, as if, Constantinople ended in the hands of the Turks, as if, by the way, the same Orthodox didn't open the gates to that, and suddenly the Muscovy took on the title of whatever, from their patriarchy as the head of all the Rus. Except, the majority of the Rus went on without that, without even, wanting to know what the hell had happened, and maintaining their tradition in places that, in some part, were under the Tsarist Empire for less than a century in their entire existence. Nevertheless, Eastern European is also important, and as fringe as it may seem, it also speaks volumes about the Western centrality, right? When you look, for example, at the Kievan knightly equipment that we discussed in multiple videos, we have observed that even though, of course, the Ruthenians were quite informed by Byzantine iconography in particular, and therefore represented themselves artistically in very particular manner, what we see archaeologically speaking, for example, in their magnificent panoplies, which were really to behold, and in some cases in relative terms, even in absolute terms, even surpassed, say, absolute individual elite element that was, however, less widespread than in the West. In fact, the same Western European panoplies, except most of these turned out to have been of Western import, mostly German. Surprise, surprise, there is a strong Turkic influence as well, and some kind of Slavic stuff on their own, but largely, and we see Western weapons up to the Volga Bulgars and beyond. And again, if you start basically studying these other people's history, and instead of remaining confined also to, this is very important as a proof that that my Western centrism isn't Western centrism because of a prejudice, but exactly because it reinforced itself completely by itself, simply by studying these other peoples around, their arms and armor, their military systems, how they fare compared to the West. And when you get that diachronic and comparative perspective, you start understanding something. That is to say that this weird philo-exoticism and Orientalism that we have been, fed forcefully, as if we were to eventually turn into a pâté de foie gras, has actually nothing to do with human dignity. It has to do only with communism, which is obviously the opposite of that unfortunately has dominated our universities for a very long time, except communism fails, as it always does, and wherever there is any trace of human dignity, there is the capacity to simply prove wrong with basic facts and very, by the way, well entrenched and available historiography that, however, in our times lacks this fundamental element, a comprehensive self-awareness, meaning that there are lots of individuals, as far as their individual territory, field of specialization is concerned, very good scholars that, however, do not know exactly anything about anything else beyond their doctoral field of expertise, and therefore will basically go to the grave without even knowing anything substantial about the whole period that they're actually studying. This is not a joke. When you look at the Frankish perspective, in many ways, you realize, first of all, that the Franks had a staggering success for reasons that are very difficult to describe. It seems that at a point that, of course, the Gauls, the most Romanized Germans, had it better. They back in the day acquired some greater power and results than what the Franks did. After all, the Franks were actually more primitive and less Romanized. They were actually strongly Romanized, but not as much as the Goths, right? Also later on, not as much as the Longobards after the first couple of generations after the settlement in what, in fact, remained essentially a Roman land, even when literally adopting a Germanic identity. And for good reasons, by the way, that we also tackled this aspect. Again, the dichotomy of Romans versus Germans is not really going to take you very far in terms of historiographical understanding. The Franks had largely succeeded in their enterprise first of all, I would like to recover this aspect. For a matter of leadership, of authority, of virility, right? Clovis has been, in Western history, one of the single most successful individuals ever. Surely among the Romano-Germanic rulers, he was by far the greatest, inasmuch as he envisioned a specific project that, had there been another leader, would have not fundamentally worked in the same way, right? Made multiple videos about Clovis. There are lots of interesting, edifying stories about him, some not so edifying. The Franks remain really very, literally hematophilic, as it's been really asserted, not just through their continuous sort of human sacrifices that were just the continuation of the normal spolio, the sacrifice of prisoners to God, and their arms and so on, but literally in the Christian hymns dedicated to them by the Gallo-Romans, by the way, that were, as we've seen, the depositories of very advanced civilization by the time standards, and had made Gaul actually the biggest, right, most resourceful country in Europe at the time. Clovis and his familial background is really interesting. There is all an intricate, struggle of worldviews, right? Just for telling you, Clovis's mother was a Thuringian, pre-Christian princess, right? Whereas his father was de facto a Roman federatus general, and his, by the way, burial was found. There was a lot there in terms of significant Romano-Germanic identity already. He was just essentially a petty king from Tournai, among the many other Franks that were there, but he succeeded through relentless struggle and really a life consolated by warfare to essentially behead all the other Frankish chieftains, to rise at the head of a de facto unified Frankish people, of course, for the time's standards of unification, to intelligently realize that Christianization had to occur straightforwardly in alliance with the Gallo-Roman and therefore also with the broader Papal Roman world, because the relations between Rome and the Franks do not begin with Charlemagne. They're incredibly rooted and violently intimate ever since, which sounds sort of bad, not in that way, but ever since Clovis, and in many ways also with Gaul before. We've seen how, for example, the evangelization of the Anglo-Saxon, one of the greatest triumphs and glories and successes in the entire history of mankind, was very well managed, not just by the papacy that led the whole thing, but through the Merovingian medium, also because the fact that the Anglo-Saxons, especially in Kent, where the whole thing started and spread from, were de facto Frankish client state of sort. Clovis, this happened slightly later, but Clovis had successfully avoided the Arianistic medium that had characterized the Goths, right? In part, he did so to link up with Constantinople, and so fully buying into Catholic orthodoxy. Most people do not understand even what this means, including the fact that Catholic is the original name of the church, as well as still today the official one of the so-called Orthodox Church. And if you don't, again, know what Catholic means, I'm very sorry for you. If anything, because Clovis knew, and Clovis knew in a universal sense, right? The Franks do not rise as yet another Romano-Germanic kingdom, right? The Frankish kingdom is established, does remain. Actually, from a background that, as we've seen, was more fractal even than, the one of the Goths, that the Romans had built all a very specific monarchic mythology and ethical dynastic past to favor what was already, among those Irano-Germanic peoples, fundamentally. Let's not exceed with the Irano, because we always think everything was mixed during migration. If you actually look at the roots of invasion, you realize that, yes, there was some mix, but these were fundamentally Germanic peoples, right? There is no doubt that the Goths, the Longobards, had important elements of Iranian knighthood in them, but at the same, the Franks recognized themselves that too, even in times where ex gloria, we could say, in which they had successfully engineered, we'll get there, a heavier cavalry, and in fact a more advanced military, aside from probably equestrian culture. The Franks not only succeed with this Catholic marriage and conversion that, as you know, actually starts from a vow in the famous battle against the Alemanni, where Clovis was losing, and the story goes that, again, he made this vow with a Christian, with God, right, as far as the conversion to Christianity is concerned, which is something, again, that there are not other gods, right? The same Wodan is the Catholic God in the Germanic tradition. If you don't understand, again, with that word, Catholic, you can't go ahead. I made multiple videos explaining how the actual conversion of the Wodanic elites was much smoother and non-violent compared to instead extirpation of the Chthonic, truly, at that sense, paganistic, meaning fractally anti-universal beliefs of the netherworld that, however, at large were basically under just by traditional hierarchy and incorporate order to these splendid elites. Clovis crushes one after the other the major powers around him that could have actually taken the place of the Franks in this broader hegemony over Gaul. Syagrius, so this last remnant, would eventually become the Frankish Neustria, north of the Loire of the Roman Empire, something that loosely looked at as that in many ways. The Alemanni, that were actually pretty tough and had also been quite a problem for the Romans historically, and that were instead crushed and had to take refuge in the Alpine valleys, controlled by the stronger power in the south. It was Theodoric, the king of Ravenna. And that originated sort of much of what we understand as the Swiss, even though the emergence of the Swiss is political mostly, as the same name of the canton says, except they were Alemanni as well. They were part of the broader Swabia, the one that would give birth to, the Hohenstaufen, and so the peak of the last Sol Invictus recorded in medieval sources for a reigning dynasty. Clovis crushes, quite importantly, the Visigoths as well, that had some internal issues. And I talked about the Battle of Rouillé. I talked about how this affected the completeness of Gaul, even from a sort of ethnic point of view, because Occitania does not really begin immediately south of the Loire, right? And part of that is an outcome of the Frankization of the system. The Burgundians are also tamed. So basically the Franks rise in Clovis' times not just to a kingdom, but to a veritable empire. Besides, Clovis, that had clothed his blood with probably an aura of sacrality, in the wake of actually what were traditional Germanic practice, including the holy anointing, that however blended here with Judeo-Christian tradition, for example, and were further reinforced later. That was a hallmark of the of the same, eventually later Carolingian, Capetian dynasties, etc. I'm preparing a video on Rem. If you're interested, there is also the story of Saint Remigius, the vase of Soissons, that is quite eloquent. None of these names are random, nor by person, nor by location, if you know what I mean. Clovis does everything in his power, and successfully so, which means, providentially speaking, if you know what providence means in the Latin etymology, not just what you think your sort of more adulterated understanding of Christianity is, really willed it, right? A Catholic power that was affirmed at this point, a point that in the span of a couple of generations would actually bring to a general collapse. There was the Justinian plague. There had been a lot of warfare, a lot of migrations, a lot of bloodbath, of general exhaustion during the migration era. A great part of the world goes to sleep. We've seen it for China, for India. Actually, the world is well awake at all times, just shrinks in many ways. It really goes under an important crisis. The Franks suffered that. If anything, for those dynastic reasons that would split the kingdom, but you see not actually bring it to an end, right? There were powers that were much more unitary and that evaporated more quickly from a historical point of view. The Franks and their proto-feudal glue was already keeping, in fact, Merovingian leadership in charge of a much broader part of the world that in as much the Franks had succeeded under and through this blood, if you know what the myth of blood is in the European tradition, to actually strip the Goths of the hegemonic leadership of Western Europe at the time. This unavoidably triggers a broader international issue, which, believe it or not, was probably the main reason behind the Justinian reconquest, beyond the obvious convenience in recovering the most advanced late antique communities of the Mediterranean. Many people think that the Justinian reconquest was an overstretch and that it was eventually punished by God by this sense of, in fact, overreach and exhaustion of the system. That happened to everybody a little bit. There's no doubt that the Byzantines contributed to that as well. But in my opinion, it was politically and strategically very sensible, including knocking out the Vandals from Africa. You understand that these Arab powers were not able to withstand the Byzantine onslaught, and that yet at the turn of the age, again, the Longobards add to the overall balance shift. The Franks are basically well encased into their vastly fat and rich North Atlantic rainy plains, and most of what was the European asset with the Visigoths also normalized in the Iberian hinterland, more or less succeeding in hegemonizing even its fringes, confers that sort of, this is how Europe was basically fragmented back in the day, and it was bad, and basically all the notion of this world is that somehow humanity had died, that cities had died, that literacy had died, everything is a dark, snowy place with smoky and muddy huts of the longhouse type. Some at most, like it's just for the top elite, somewhere in a depopulated area where life was terrible and nothing happened. Right? Of course, actually, Roman civilization in the West straightforwardly continued in the greatest accomplishment, not just of the Goths are knocked out by the Arabs eventually, that in part also, as we were saying before, live off what had been the very intense Roman legacy in southern Spain. Gaul, Italy, the incipient identification of essentially a lay and ecclesiastical power in the Merovingian Empire and the Church of Rome, with extraordinary extensions such as Anglo-Saxon England that managed its independence and eventual coalescence in a de facto unified realm on the longer run, of course, actually witness to the inclination towards a Catholic orientation. If you look at really the relations between Rome, also the Longobards with Milan, also with even with Byzantine Ravenna, if you understand how much the Exarchate had Italianized, especially, and it didn't last very long, right? In Byzantine hands, we'll see this better now. Even before Charlemagne, right? That was taken over by the Longobards in de facto Italian kingdom at that point. If you look at the geographical extension, Charlemagne had just not come in a few decades. The Longobards would have consistently taken over the last remnants of Byzantine presence in the peninsula. And it is also not random when you realize why Charlemagne took over the peninsula, which is also what you can read in the title here already hinted at. But Merovingian Gaul is really the base, not just of a lot of sort of manpower, and as we were saying before, in spite of that sort of formal political division, not even formal, telling you the truth, but de facto political division to various dynastic branches, was actually very unitary in a military, religious, and social cultural way. It was the launching pad for the evangelization of what today we call Germany in the further coordination also, in fact, of the Anglo-Saxon and Celtic, the Celtic evangelization missions that were, in this sense, achieving more than what the Byzantines were doing in the East. I made a specific video about that because when you realize that, what Rome manages to evangelize in the early and high Middle Ages, and the fact that the Byzantines just evangelized the Serbs, the Bulgars, the Rus, and the Khazars, compared to all the rest of Europe, that there is probably some indication of at least of a problem from the Constantinopolitan side, and that is obviously not happening by chance, especially considering that Northeastern Europe had not really witnessed like a civilization before, right? And that the Roman Frankish model spreads pretty darn well all across that enormous extension of land that, although, again, more scarcely populated and colder, which is not good for agriculture at the time, with sparser communication, without a urban tradition, etc., still is, however, a pretty big chunk of Europe with lots of people in absolute terms that will basically, without any issue, convert to Christianity in the end, right? If you cross out basically this, the conquest of Saxony, which was mostly a problem between the Franks and the Saxons that dated back a lot of time before, and if you consider that the Saxons routinely looted the Rhineland, and at some point forced conversion, deportation, and massacres really do not happen for no reason, as also we should understand for something that is happening right now in the Middle East, you realize that the general sense of Catholic fulfillment, and especially through the lens of broader chivalric and imperial, in fact, in the genetic capacity of those times rulers was really impressive. In that sense, Charlemagne is really the father of Europe. All right. It's obvious that an empire like the Carolingian one could have never emerged from, Saxony, right? And that it took, in fact, the Romano-Frankish molding of Saxony for that people, also endowed with kind of bloodthirsty character. Look at how they were depicting the Bible to them when converting them, that is Christ like a Germanic comitatus leader with the apostles as his military retinue, St. Peter cutting the ear to the guard in the Gethsemane as one, with enormous blood profusion to excite the conquest fantasies of this people. It was used also some of the early international mercies out there. Fit a broader alchemy combination of success that was very alive, for example, among the Romans, the Romano-Italics, this capacity of tradition and innovation at the same time, this capacity of mastering the means of the time while sticking to the perennial principle of the fathers, right? And I made multiple videos about the patrician foundation of Indo-European rule in the legacy of all of these peoples. The Carolingian Empire could have not existed without a Roman Empire, could have not existed without the Roman ecclesiastical organization that was quite straightforward, based on urbanization, based on the various districts that in Carolingian and Frankish world were essentially overlapping with the counties, and that are, aside from the sort of feudal irregularity in territorial formation later times, were meant to remain at the basis of this cornerstone of today's European political administration. That is a process of romanization. It's something that is doubled down on by the Carolingians in fact, not just the expansion of their empire, the necessities of administration, but by the gigantic effort of getting everything possible from Rome, right, and its Catholic, and so properly the Italian dimension and Mediterranean and especially the Papal hierarchical model to north of the Alps, right? Aachen is founded as the Rome of the North in stone, something really exceptional for the time being in those areas, and really as a pole, right? This idea of the North Pole, of the South Pole, is very Indo-European, is very transcendental, is very Catholic, and very much connected with, of course, the effort of replicate heavenly order on earth by that alchemy, with that combination of action and contemplation, right, of the empire and the church, that had become necessary, at least since humanity had lost more or less by the age of Augustus. And so the birth of Christ, that confidence in the capacity of self-salvation, and therefore required a split between those who held sort of earthly power and those who functionalized in the spiritual training in order to collectively attain a divine power as a united, in this case, Europe, right? The Imperium is that deal, right? And just think that, I don't know, the King of France and the Pope in the early 14th century will literally claim for each other the title of Caesar. If you really understand that action and contemplation are actually interchangeable, right? And if you consider what was, in fact, the de facto religious role of the Capetian kings that officiated the mass on the battlefield and that actually achieved sainthood and claimed like this holy anointing, recognition as rulers, and the popes really had a veritable secular power, just like bishops had historically, and so not much a matter of earthly one, as people like to extremize the concept. Like secular does not specifically mean earthly, as if the seculum was separated from God, right? That's not correct, right? That can easily slope towards a dualistic heresy. There is not an hypostatic separation between the divine and the lower nature, all right? Whatever happens in the fallen world is just a reflection of divine unity and perennial order, right, that we get the echo of just because we still have the spark of divinity potential that, however, we're not able to enact as we're fading away in our own regard. Well, men like Charlemagne, right, we would have really known what it meant to be covered in blood, right, and surrounded by chopped human beings in order to achieve the conquest of large swathes of Europe, right, really meant, right? The only way to attain this divine glory was to, first of all, reconstitute the Roman Empire, and therefore reconstituting the lay and ecclesiastical unity of the world. If you are familiar with ecclesiastical history and the centrality of the papacy, in not just in the spiritual hegemony of the West, but in as much as the Byzantines were never able to basically dictate rule to the Pope, and basically ended up paying for their own sclerotization towards what was, in line of principle, a bit like in the Arab world, in that case was more extreme, like with total lack of priesthood, right? But in Constantinople, the notion that the church had to be just fully subservient to the emperor ended up losing the game, in as much as the papacy managed to direct the imperial might of the West towards a newly revived, not just Catholic, but Roman axis, right? Rome as the center of the cosmos, the holy herbs as the east of the West, right? The perennially rising sun of the West. Charlemagne, the Franks, any other people actually that lived in the outskirts, even those that had not been reached yet, not by Romanity, nor by, Roman control, say better, because Romanity had transfigured the world, in case you didn't notice, but the Frankish rule as well, were absolutely aware of. Right? There was never a place in Europe where, as long as the Roman Empire had happened, or also Alexander's empire had happened for that matter, had not known. They were just living their own life out there. They were all looking at that, right? The fact that they're not, literate and they haven't left a history does not mean that they weren't all polarized towards what was happening in this reality. And I think that the history of the Roman Empire is pretty self-eloquent in that manner. In the Urals, they knew what Rome was. Rome even ignored the extension, the geographical extension of today's Russia. So we can't really think that, as I explained also in a video about the traditional meaning of space, that there is no such thing like equality at any level, nor physical, nor existential, nor individual. All right, the world is molded by providence and divine law as the foundation of its own reconstitution, right? Rome being the center of this, right? In a more international sense, there were two axes where the Carolingian Empire was versed to expand. As we've seen, the Franks had managed to hegemonize, accomplice, again, the support of the Gallo-Roman world, the extensive estates, the fact that Clovis had recompensated his Frankish warriors with seigneuries scattered all over this wide Atlantic plains we're talking about, and getting gradually civilized and collectively committed to this imperial effort. Also, in fact, especially through the Carolingians, basically re-engineered this fresh forces from Austrasia, but de facto grafting themselves unavoidably as on a Neustrian power that was the actual heartland of Carolingian imperial power. One axis is, which is also a bit sort of underrated, is the expansion along the Danube. Right, this area is probably what we call Central Europe, where the concept, in fact, of Mitteleuropa would stem from. One that entailed, in some ways, an unforgiving and sort of, to some point, lost funded effort of civilization. Meaning that fighting the Slavs, the Avars, I mean, it's not like it was particularly difficult in general, or the Saxons had been tougher, etc. But if anything, there was a broader difficulty in political hegemonization of these lands. You could show off, you could, besiege a fortified hilltop, slaughter everybody inside, etc. But at the end of the day, there would be many others that had taken refuge in the forests, in the mountains, would come back sooner or later, and you didn't have enough surplus locally to create anything more stable, which was the same for these other populations that gradually also civilized themselves through the Carolingian influence. I mean, the Avars were knocked out, as we all know, but I'm talking mostly about the Western Slavs that were the first ones, especially the Czechs, to receive that kind of more institutional and political stability, imitating the Carolingian. I mean, they were closer to civilization. There is nothing to do about that. That absolutely matters, right? The other axis was the Mediterranean and the Byzantine ambition, which unavoidably posited the Franks in contrast with the Byzantine ambition to reclaim Italy in a political strategy rooted in the Justinian legacy and even older ones. Now, what we're looking at today, paradoxically, is of course a Frankish victory, but also a de facto resolution of the European issue that derived from this contrasting ambition, right? That can even be seen as a pivotal transcendence of the long-standing rivalry, often more theoretical than practical, but consistently looming in the background, right, between these powers. Because, of course, as I was talking about before, the Byzantine reconquest was actually designed, in great part, to stem a Merovingian expansion. Right? If it hadn't been for the Longobards that sort of wedged themselves in between the two contendants, the Franks and the Byzantines would have gone. They actually went at war, as you know, at the Battle of the Garigliano, for example, where they were defeated by Narses. These were groups of Franks, of Burgundians, of Alemanni that basically took advantage of the collapse of Gothic Italy to launch some raid here and there. to in fact stem to go at war in this very territory, in this very theater that was unavoidably, as we've seen, the center of the world. Right? The Franks start their rise not by the Danube, right? They start their rise through Gaul, and so the unavoidable destination of any Gallic power being, when unified, the Italian peninsula. The Byzantines naturally, from their own side, had suffered, first of all, in the immediate centuries, the loss of half of their territory at the hands of the Muslims, which naturally had not been a particularly healthy occurrence, but that, as we have explained, looking at a very simple comparison between Eastern and Western spirituality, had done a much worse job, in fact, than anyone in Christianity at that point to maintain an actual Catholic unity. When you look at the Byzantine Empire, you say, this is the actual Roman Empire, so containing its Catholic legacy and therefore universal reach. Well, you should explain why they suddenly lost half of their territories, including ones that had historically been under Rome for a very long time. And there are naturally complex explanations of this that, however, can never be separated from the actual spiritual condition in loco, which was actually very fragmented, right? We've seen how the Eastern churches historically were not just heretical, but they were also disorganized within themselves. Of course, the Byzantines, as de facto Greeks, maintain a substantial upper hand through both their Hellenistic and Roman legacy on these peoples in a general sense, but not one would be enough, in fact, to keep them together. And even though Christians remained in these territories under the Arabs, they were in many ways, especially in Egypt, those who had opened the gates to them, and where the few Orthodox Catholics in that, or Catholics to begin with, in these lost lands to Islam, were often harassed by still those heresies that would keep characterizing those regions. I made an entire video explaining this. There were even early Christian prophecies about the collapse of the Eastern churches, right, as opposed to a West that, while Constantinople was doing all kind of equilibristic moves to try to compromise with these terrifying doctrines emerging from the Levant, was absolutely in line with the Pope on any theological matters, including the Arian peoples, meaning that the Longobards that were at some point even at war with not just the empire, but sacking, for example, the surroundings of Rome, in front of certain schism caused by this weird appeasing policy of the Byzantines. You understand, of course, in terms of pragmatism, but not in terms of actual traditional, like if you're right, you win, stuck with the Pope. There is a radical theological coherence and Catholic orthodoxy in the West compared to anything the Byzantines were doing, right? If we are to take, for example, a universal empire at that point, and also in its claim of Romanity, just on the basis of its doctrinal correctness and also its eventual political and territorial unity, well, we can't say that the East fared particularly well or better than the West, right? You can't argue that the Arabs took over Spain, and the Visigothic system, as far as I always understood, was pretty messed up in many ways, but it's not the entire picture. But when you look at the West, even though there is a namely political division, we're still looking at the same Latin-Germanic blend, the same Catholic orthodoxy. Arianism melts away without any kind of violent strife or bloodshed. If anything, the Visigoths, for example, were the ones, unsurprisingly, who had the greatest problem with that, But we understand that were, even for them, not really real. I mean, there were theological issues, but not stemming from a higher ecclesiastical vision or culture. To them, it was mostly about a struggle between the monarchy and the nobility that took on those characteristics. I mean, even the Longobards did so, even still up to the second half of the 7th century, but nobody in Longobard Italy, contrary to any stereotype, was thinking that, I don't know, the Kingdom of Italy wasn't there, it wasn't unitary, and or, I don't know, that they had to kill Catholics or Rome. Absolutely not. They were uniformly homogeneous. And these, say, factions were just named after this older Germanic tradition of taking on again the Arian Christianity in its, again, as a form of international and at this point mostly domestic shout out, without any theological implication whatsoever. Also because the sources do not really yield that, right? It's not like the Longobards weren't writing. They emanated the Edictum Rotary. It is by far the most important Germanic code of law ever issued. In Latin, obviously, and without caring absolutely anything about, giving no hint whatsoever about any kind of religious tension existing in the West. Right. This is extremely important. It's extremely important also what I said before regarding the fact that actually there was not much of a struggle between Christian and pre-Christian ideas. It was mostly a matter of broader political compaction and the obvious universal direction that Europe was to take. At that point, it's obvious that the West had actually made, by Charlemagne, had the better results, right? And not only that, but it had grown more powerful. By Charlemagne's time, the West had actually already won in comparison to the East, meaning that the outcome was evidently positive compared to, say, the Justinian era. And this is also macroscopically incontrovertible. There is a debate about when between 800 and, say, 1200, so in a few centuries, really, Western civilization really started giving unequivocal signs of the surpassing of the Byzantine one, right? A great problem, in my opinion, is to see, let's say, the Byzantine Empire as a sort of cohesive state, as opposed to some kind of Greek hegemonic, potentially regional power stemming from the Aegean and being able to, in fact, successfully hegemonize mostly a coastal and urban dimension while absorbing as a consequence simply like all the peoples who lived in the valleys leading to the sea. Also because their interlands were much less developed than the Western European ones. I mean, where had Moesia gone, right? Compared to even, I don't know, Cisalpine Gaul or Belgica even, where you can't deny that the eastern half of the empire by this point already, and it's literally just less than 400 years after the fall of the western half of the Roman Empire, was disintegrated compared to a West that was gradually but successfully as homogeneously compacting itself along very specifically, let's say, cohesive universal lines. And of course, the Carolingian Empire is a bit like the greatest proof of that, right? None of that kind had ever properly been conceived on a Romano-Germanic basis, and yet it was done in a matter of a few generations, really. It's incredible. Not as incredible as the literal explosion of Western civilization in the following centuries that overwhelms the entire Western Eurasian Mediterranean in terms of centrality and dependency on itself. It's difficult again to simply give an actual dimension of that. That you should talk about the second period, if you look at the trade balance shift at the end of the so-called Islamic Golden Age, if you realize that, I don't know, the European markets and banking in the later Middle Ages were essentially the engine of this broader era. It's not like, again, Europeans ever conquered Persia at that point. But in many ways, like the only like bulky civilization that existed, rather than seeing so many fragmented states scattered all over this region, is unequivocally and disproportionately concentrated in Western Europe, and essentially in the wake of the Latin-Germanic tradition that by this time has also encompassed also an important, actually the majority of the Slavic world as well, right? Which should never be forgotten. Right. There are people today that have very weird cultural references and come up with things like, because now the mental illness of this era, the feministic fantasy, because, you know, in my opinion, it stems from, I mean, we know that women are more into fantasy in general than sort of world grasping. I will be banned from YouTube because of this, but I have encountered like this attitude of presuming that there's something inherent about, for example, the Slavic world as rough and tough and pure and traditional, where, you know, the West is lame, it's decadent, it's whatever. And there was a guy, I remember, but you know, I don't remember where this stemmed from, but basically this guy was arguing that, I don't know, in his mind, a country like Croatia, since it was Slavic, was not part of the West, because, you know, today those are the countries that really got it, you know, and, you know, they're so powerful and successful, and, you know, without no, and it was specifically a reference to the West, to this idea that was talking about the evangelization of Europe in the Middle Ages and so on, and without knowing that. He put Croatia together with Serbia, by the way, for the great pleasure of our Croat followers. And again, Bulgaria said, what do they have to do with the West? I think he added even Hungary to that. Like, well, you may want to notice that Croatia and Hungary were evangelized by the papacy and have remained Catholic countries ever since, aside from the despicable Calvinism that spread at some point, especially in Hungary. But I mean, if there are countries that fit the broader Western world in that, at least by these medieval Catholic standards, there's no doubt it's sort of, say, Franco-Roman ones. Indeed, okay, these countries are Central European, all right? Croatia, yeah, it's split between Southern and Central Europe, but Hungary, in that sense, it's not Western, but literally, like, we have people today that have to minimize, that's why I brought up this example, they have to minimize everything that the West has ever accomplished without realizing that it's something so bigger than that they think, that it exceeds any other scale, including the one of sort of basic education at some point, because these are things that you do not learn in school. This is not some heretical perspective on some abstract take on whatever. This is basic, like, look at what countries were civilized, were developed under whom, in which circumstance. You will realize that, especially the idea of the interconnection of Europe, is something incredibly old, right? That's why I brought up before the nationalistic examples, because nationalism is not the traditional understanding of the nation. Also by Indo-European standards, for example, it is basically a post-traditional ideology that wants you to stop to your piece of dirt, not to your divine spark and possibility to take over the world as the sole purpose of any dignified human being, right? As these men, including the Croats or the Magyars when they arrived, absolutely had in mind, except they didn't have the means to achieve in the way they were eventually absorbed themselves, in fact, by the Carolingian, the broader Frankish civilization. We can call it Franco-Roman, and we will understand in part now why. When we look at, of course, the Byzantines and the Franks, we realize that their contrast had never been resolved, right? And nor it would be resolved in Carolingian times. There's a broader issue between the Latin and the Greek world that is also broader than merely the ecclesiastical level per se. It obviously is baked into the wall, but can't be. It's often stressed as a form of. It's a matter of churches, right? As if, again, those were those classifications made in the 90s where people tried to box countries on the basis of, single homogeneous blocks, like the Orthodox world. What the hell does that even mean? Like, why would you flatten, like, with all the historical evidence available, why do you want to flatten anything to that? I mean, the power of Europe in this sense stands in its difference within the various components, but its traditional Catholic capacity to hierarchically order alongside those characteristics. This is the only universal doctrine that any of these people believed, and that were also kind of compliant to in the moment exactly in which they would accept Christianization, which they would make a step further to actually become more powerful countries, right? How would you survive in the world, by the way? Do you think that you survive in the world by creating safe spaces and isolating, not being powerful, not wielding war as a normal political tool? Like, how do you think that a civilization and a culture work? I understand that most people today do not have any civilization or any culture whatsoever, because being born somewhere has nothing to do with your human worth, which is the only mean by which you measure that. And you have to demonstrate to have any to be properly called like that. Human, by the way, is an insult in tradition. It means dirty, etymologically speaking, from humus, by the way. And there is a difference between mankind and humanity, right? Now, the tension between the Franks and the Byzantines endured and was formally articulated through the Carolingian adoption via the renowned coronation of Charlemagne by Pope Leo III in Rome in 800 of a Roman Imperial title that stood in opposition to the ideological universalism, at least the self-referential universalism of the Eastern Empire, which continued to officially identify itself as Roman. And again, I don't have any problem with that. It's not like I have to denigrate the Byzantines. They were Romans, all right? They could call whatever they wanted. Their titles differed, just for telling you that there is not a way, okay, I check here the box of Roman, it's identical to any place. And again, because of the same hierarchical order in which the component of the empire actually allocate themselves. And obviously, if there are two different empires instead of one, at least if we understand the empire in a Victorian sense, just to be honest, not in the metaphysical traditional one, there is a problem. That is to say, between these two contendants and competitors, who's the better? Who's more actually Roman by that point, right? And people who usually follow the legalistic principle of the Byzantines do not even realize that, stating that, Byzantine is a word that you should not use, has nothing to do with anything that they were even believing at the time. And you would say, that's exactly why we don't want you to call them Byzantines. Well, so we have to explain all the time what we mean by Roman. This is a pure convention, obviously enough. And we express the term Byzantine to exactly describe the unique way, like anybody's unique way, to God, that specifically that, if anything, not universal, or at least not factually universal power, as long as it was held, again, by a head that could fight with another head in the West, would perceive themselves. We also made videos recently where we showed that different imperial titles at some point were even abandoned by the Byzantines. Basileus, for example, has actually a slightly less traditional meaning, say semantics, origin, of course, and etymology from imperator, and it's also Greek equivalents to some degree that naturally are never equivalent to the Latin one, but again, different peoples called that in different ways historically. That's not the problem. The problem is how, of course, the same Byzantines had an officially Roman past with very specific Latin terminology, including Roman, whereby it's and again they could call obviously themselves in different ways, but just even terminologically speaking, Basileus stresses a more sort of autocratic form of power, right? Which is all good if you look at what the past intended by that in terms of sacred royalty, but it's a concept that does not stress universality unless, of course, you understand that the monarch at that point should be the only monarch in the world. Imperator is truly a guy who is living through the imperium right now, right? So it's something which, in theory, in the Indo-European theology, would actually equate themselves. Again, they stem from different branches of the Indo-European languages and takes on this. So I can't stress now enough the very Hellenically conservative reasons why, for example, Basileus was resumed at some point or applied again to a Roman reality that had not used it, when in fact the Imperatores had been crushing the Basileus, for example. But it's more than that. It's something that, for example, also with the Bulgars was sort of imitated, but also taken away from and then resumed instrumentally. So to a degree that you realize that wasn't very hieratic, wasn't very absolute, wasn't very perennial. It was just, very instrumental, as a matter of fact. The Westerners were instead always coherent with that imperial title, at least. Indeed, there is a gap between Charlemagne and the previous Roman imperatores, because never forget, we will see it better now, that Charlemagne was crowned actually emperor of the Romans, right? But again, the continuity in that ideological conception and the validity of this title for an empire like Charlemagne's that frankly was actually bigger than the one of the last emperors of the West, I would say speak of a quite straightforwardly traditional, orthodox, you could say, coherence that was manifest, especially in the mentality and lifestyle of these individuals. First of all, you have, in the Frankish world, a reviving of the original, so Roman concept of imperial order that on medieval manuals is often described in terms of the late antique bureaucratic and very frankly Byzantine sort of more centralized and statalistic, in fact legalistic and authoritarian, brutally authoritarian system. Look at how, again, the Byzantine emperors tried to have themselves obeyed by the popes, failing in that. And so traditionally you can't even appeal at that point and at any level. Compared to what, in fact, Romanity had actually been. I mean, if you had asked the 4th century BC Roman who was worthier to be an imperium holder between a lord like Charlemagne and the Basileus of Constantinople, the closest resemblance was definitely to the Franks, right? This is not just a suggestion, and it doesn't derive just from the definitive admiration that the Romans expressed in their sources from Caesar to Tacitus for all those people that the Roman propaganda polluted our vision of the... I don't know if you realize that, but the Romans had a positive ethnoanthropological understanding and vision of the Germans, right? If you don't know that, of course, I know that you don't know what Latin literature is and that therefore you're an ignorant by definition, but that's exactly the point, together with what Romanity had really consisted of, not just of a patrician rule, which generally speaking fit with the nobiliar order that the Franks had established by this point, but also a more, in this sense, classically liberal, we could use, realization that in order to create power in the world from our fallen kind, the action of an enlightened elite to give trust, right, and a possibility of redemption to the marginated, to those who have really nothing to lose, can lead to very big things, such as the same Roman Empire or the Napoleonic conquest. Doesn't matter also on the level of sort of doctrinal distancing from the ultimate origins, because it's not like in Napoleonic times, yes, the French were just some filthy Jacobins / communists, and I don't know, other people in the world were so traditional and successful. Like, they literally fell. Like, there is no excuse in the traditional world for defeat whatsoever. And we know also what the consequence of that era fundamentally ended up being. The same can be said for the Frankish Antrustiones, can be said for the Carolingian paladins. And we know very well how Charlemagne himself, this is really typical of the monarchs, by the way, would, say, promote from the lower ranks some incredibly brave, capable, successful, and renowned warriors that had proven, by the way, in this time in which we're transitioning from something more than a warrior, again, also because of the collapse in individual standards, but in order to wield a greater power extension like Charlemagne was concerned, Carolingian cavalry was really more advanced than a Scandinavian herder for that matter. But indeed, expressing what had already been founded by the Merovingians, by Clovis' time. And so at the end of this Roman war that had sort of crept into itself at some point, losing it, right, in favor of this more primitive, but in some way more genuine peoples that didn't manage to restore the empire as it was, right? So it's not like anybody won from the fall of the Roman Empire, but that managed to inject some of their best element that had traditionally been shared also by the Romans and any other universally successful people in the past. That is that sense of direct recognition of command, of honor, of authority, right? In the Frankish mentality, the concept, also the basis of medieval chivalry, right, in sense of honor and knightly ethos, etc. The fact that in order to be a leader, you don't have to impose yourself. Like if you truly are one, you will be followed, right? People will stick by you, and out of the moment of crisis that requires this collective unity, these people will come back as liberi, right, in their abodes. Once that, in fact, the king does not even need to dislodge, even though Clovis, on the wake of the same Roman public demand, had perfectly accepted that everything that he had conquered belonged to him as medium of the Imperium, that is, the Holy Ghost sent by God, as opposed to be, I don't know, some property of the Frankish people in an extensive sense, right? So a sense of purity that manages to overcome the simple legalistic identitaristic point of the Byzantines, simply claimed to be universal rulers and had to acknowledge, as actually after Charlemagne's crowning was literally expressed by a famous Byzantine chronicle, that by that point Rome had been fully lost to the Franks, like from a Byzantine perspective. Which is something that if you're called Roman Empire, you may want to take in consideration, especially since, and nobody had conquered Rome before, right? These are not, by the way, Alaric's Visigoths that were actually also de facto created as a people, as the Roman army of Illyricum by the same empire back in the day, and that actually revered the empire and even were careful in the way they looted Rome without excesses, because they knew that as they risked later further that they could be wiped out once again, sent to bleed for the Romans, as they had already done in previous generations on the eastern frontier. And that obviously who had taken over Rome was now a veritable and formally styled and recognized Roman emperor. Roman emperor. By the way, I don't know if you have ever been to, if you've ever noticed, if anything, if you've been to St. Peter's Basilica, the red porphyry stone on the left of the entrance that nobody knows about. That is obviously that was moved from the original position. As you know, the basilica was remained in the Renaissance, but that is it's a round red square stone. The same exact porphyry on which Charlemagne kneeled to be crowned by the Pope. Right, and that's the other element, because the papacy and Rome historically were part of the Roman Empire, as we just explained. Nobody had ever conquered Rome. I mean, Rome had never been part of any other polity but the Roman Empire up to that point. The Ostrogothic kingdom was essentially something mostly wielded by Theodoric and his Goths, but in a Roman reality, right? The Romans, the Byzantines had anyway managed to recover Rome in general. So ever since, like the Longobards never conquered, when they tried, but it didn't happen. And had it happened, by the way, it would have probably happened in very, at that point, settled terms like with the Franks, because if that happened, it's because in Rome they would have finally had, as there was, like a supporting faction at the head, in charge, of which the Pope would have been an emanation, a pro-Longobard sense. But here we're looking, in fact, at the Roman Pope that up to the 12th century, by the way, continued to maintain a pretty open and straightforward relation with Constantinople. Right here we made the point that the Byzantines made out we lost Rome, but from a papal perspective in particular, the sense was that he was wielding both halves of the empire, right, of which, of course, he was sort of the meeting ground, also in concrete terms, given that we're talking of an earthly patrimonium, as you know, Sancti Petri. Now, what's the deal with the Pope? Is that, as we explained also before, he was already, first of all, the spiritually hegemonic figure in the West, the only ones in the West that did not accept the Pope, if not in a lateral sense, were the Visigoths, who thought they could create essentially their own universal councils in the Iberian Peninsula, mostly styling them after the Byzantine ones of Constantinople, the ecumenic ones of Constantinople. See what happened to the Visigoths, by the way. And, the Visigothic rite was eliminated in the first centuries of the Reconquista as the Roman papacy exploited the desperation, of course, of the northern Iberian Christians to make them accept the Roman rite in exchange for, in fact, Roman support, which was also Frankish support, meaning sending also Frankish, war bands to join the Reconquista, which is something that starts, frankly, pretty early on. It's not like the Franks, by the way, had not historically infested the northern Iberian Peninsula to harass the Goths. Well, they will start doing the same against the Arabs at the same time. Accidents aside, such as Roncesvalles, but those are the Basques, and in part they're also siding with the Muslims at some point. But that's also another story. Again, what's the deal with the Pope? Well, the Pope represents not just the Western hegemonic spirit. Everybody recognizes the papacy. The wide evangelization of Europe is occurring under the direction of the papacy. Missionaries from Germany literally write to the Pope at every single step of the evangelization, asking them what to specifically do. Rome controls this, right? The church is international. This is a blended world. This happens before Charlemagne, right? And I can't stress how unitary the West in this, especially Italic, Gallic, British axis already was, right? And it was the most performing of all, and the most shaded, right, in that sense of towards like the southern Mediterranean Roman civilization to the northern and Nordic, Germanic, sort of, can't say barbarism, but somehow like more primitive background, but still united and coherently functional all together in that sum of spheres of influence. The Byzantines obviously recognized the Roman primacy of honor, charity, They had tried their best to make Constantinople recognized as the other historical metropolitic see of the empire, that, as you know, were all apostolic sees. Of course, the Roman one was double, and the peak of it, that's where, of course, the foundation of the church had been unavoidably transmigrated. And it could have not been otherwise given the Roman Catholic legacy of the city and its imperial centrality. Therefore, the priestly power that would have to recognize the standards of basically any imperial matter, this would escalate, especially during the investiture controversy, but we've seen how, in this sense, the Byzantines could impose on their Constantinopolitan Patriarchate an actual obedience, right? They never achieved this with the papacy, who actually and simply conferred, recognized, bestowed the Roman imperial title to Charlemagne, right? And this cannot pass unnoticed. It's not, again, this is the point I really want to insist the most, because it happens that, of course, like also on the channel, we make less videos about, say, the 6th, the 7th, the 8th century, and especially these matters. But the Pope was not some random guy, right? I don't know if you noticed, obviously, and jokes aside, he was not a random guy in the sense that this was not a random church, right? The papal monarchy established in the 11th century was also not a random establishment. That spiritual hegemony, as we've seen, was already present, was already recognized in a central fashion, right? It could be understood traditionally that there were still ecumenic councils that mostly, by the way, were here Byzantine legacy, and so actually something pertaining just to the Byzantine world, not much to the broader one of the West as well. There were regional councils across the West. They were becoming ever more interconnected, and the Pope, of course, had to do with that. As you know, that would end up being also the only place where such councils were still held by the late Middle Ages. We made multiple videos, especially from the time of Innocent III, that is a bit the peak of that achieved papal universalism, pastorally and beyond. This means that what the Byzantines had basically just maintained out of that continuity from the Roman tradition, state, and broader cultural legacy. Again, I made really lots of videos on the Byzantine Empire, and again, I know that I tend to highlight mostly this shortcoming, right? But because I've seen too much fanboyism online and in the regarding it, and regarding this sort of criterion-less support towards the Byzantines against the West for reasons that are exquisitely contemporary and in very negative ideological reasons, including literally the self-sabotage of the West. I mean, I found people that said, okay, now I will focus just on Byzantine history because they lied to me that it did not exist, so the West sucks, and I don't want to even know what happened in the Middle Ages. I'm not a doctor in medicine, but at least this suggests hints of mental illness. I may be wrong, but I see a pattern, and it's a bit difficult not to recognize it. When this power cannot blend, what's the purpose of the church to begin with? Is to show to humanity that there is a power beyond that no one on earth can dare to overcome. At most, it can align with it. At most, you can have a ruler that becomes God, but not more than God. And thus, the relation with the church must be uniquely coherent and positive and integrated to this. It cannot be a positive. It cannot be based on imposition. All right? I cannot stress enough the cruelty of the Byzantine behavior towards the papacy. in the West, there would never actually be something of this kind. The position is something, exile is another. There are pretty dark times also in the Western Church, as far as especially the direct appointment of the popes on the side of the emperors, even though it's always been more complicated than that, and it also lasted for a few times. And there's also another aspect of the crowning ceremonial. I made one video, if anything, describing this already. That is notorious, by the way. That is to say, there is not just in the recognition of the Roman imperiality the papal crowning. There is, to fully complete the picture, the election, the recognition of this crowning, and so the full election of the emperor by the Roman people. Imagine that this must have been incredibly beautiful. I mean, imagine in the Rome of the 9th century, literally, like, you have the Roman people here is the nobility, the senators that still exist, by the way. Again, we're not overwhelmingly documented on the nature of the Senate, but these remain in the same way. I mean, it's also how most city councils historically would keep working, also from Roman times. Literally recognizing, so acclaiming and saluting the emperor. This was saying how central Romanity really is, right, to this all. Charlemagne, there was all the story that he didn't know that the Pope put a crown on his head. It is obviously like just this complete myth. It doesn't make any sense. It probably wasn't even a thing, really. Like, it's just a literary expedient in Charlemagne's biography. But we're talking about a very deliberately, first of all, a very deliberate and planned action, but obviously a natural and I would say unavoidable one by that point in the increase of Frankish imperial grandeur. Besides, what we will stress here is that the Carolingians had literally conquered Italy. This had not happened just by Charlemagne booking a low-cost flight to Rome and, in 5 minutes getting crowned and coming back to one of his rural residences. Actually, also the Carolingians at that time lived more in cities than we think. Here we're talking about a process of integration within the broader Frankish Empire that at this point, again, has been taking over an ever greater amount of peoples into of the Italic kingdom, actually of the Longobard kingdom, which will also, as you know, remain at the root of the imperial legitimacy, meaning that if you didn't have the Italic Iron Crown, you couldn't become a Holy Roman Emperor, simply because the notion was that Italy was not a land like any other, mostly because of its Romanity. At this point, it's the Pope that mostly incarnates that, even though the aforementioned patrimonium was believed not to be part of an earthly dominion, but still it was to be, in this sense, like a bit the meeting point between lay and ecclesiastical power in a physical, metaphysical sense. But it's obvious that if you did not control, in a strictly strategic sense, the Longobard kingdom, you could not be emperor. So much so that Charlemagne does something I like to remember always because it's so straightforwardly important, that he did not do with any other conquered land. He took on the title of King of the Longobards, so much so that Charlemagne was not just, of course, Roman Emperor at this point, but he was King of the Franks and King of the Longobards, right? The other, you see, this is interesting because the way, remember the thing I said before about the terms of hierarchy and recognition of autonomy and individual liberty in the Transalpine mentality. Well, this had been the case of the Frankish kingdom towards, I don't know, the Burgundian one, the Alemanni. Those were not really kingdoms anymore. The Aquitanians, the Saxons, etc. It's not before the Franks are recognized as emperors that these will also legalistically, a bit like in the Byzantine sense, but it didn't have to do with that, frankly, and was part, in fact, more of that new renewed Imperial Roman Latin-Germanic legacy, in fact, subjects of the whole empire, pertaining to the whole empire. But it's not like the Franks were kings of the Burgundians, right? Because they were not Burgundians. This may seem as sort of subtle difference, but it's important. The Carolingians acknowledge that being king of Italy, because the kingdom was known as Longobard Kingdom, it's Charlemagne, his successor, to change it into Italic Kingdom because it sounded less ethnic in an anti-Carolingian sense, because of course there was some sort of Longobard resistance to Frankish rule, but things worked smoothly also, in particular smoothly at the end of the day, in part also because of this respect of the Franks towards the Longobards, for many reasons, because up to that point, before the wars, Pippin the Short, etc., this early connections with the papacy, while the Longobards were essentially to unite the peninsula, including taking over Rome. In that moment in which the pro-Frankish papal faction called the Franks and the Longobards were very good allies and friends. I mean, Charles Martel actually called Liutprand, the king of the Longobards, to assist him in Provence with the Saracens, and the Longobards even sent troops there. So there is a lot of non-obvious narration to this, because the Longobard eventually appears as a bit even maybe the cultural alter ego, like the guy that gets eventually defeated. It's a bit, again, all that sense of the Italian subordination to greater, more cohesive powers. Just yesterday I was talking about the loss of independence during the Italian wars. This is yet another occurrence in which that Transalpine, well, in that case it was mostly because of the Spanish, but still the French had attempted that and partly even succeeded at some moment in doing so. I think about Napoleon later. So this is something which, as we were recalling yesterday, never actually leads to some sort of, I don't know, steamrolling of the Italian polities or cultures. It's mostly just like the integration of this very precious part of Europe into a greater universal, and truly universal plan, as it really was, the one that we just exemplified in various examples, right? And especially in Carolingian times, because again, the notion that this was really the land of the Romans, this was really the real land of the Romans, where also Rome really led, and this was actually a very civilly and institutionally, administratively advanced kingdom, was all something that the Franks absolutely needed to exploit and to preserve as much as they could, and to draw from as much as they could, especially in terms of ecclesiastical administration. You know that basically Charlemagne and Louis the Pious will do as much as they could to establish, in the absence of an actual state north of the Alps, because we just described a sort of vassalic beneficiary mechanism through which mostly the Carolingian Empire had sustained itself to relentless expansionism. But again, the church, the Frankish church, even though through similar mechanism as eliminating the inheritability of the offices, would in fact establish a very robust ecclesiastical and also monastic net that will be really the connective fabric of post-Carolingian Europe in a very tough time that, however, tested and rewarded the Carolingian doing. This is very important, and not bad for a people that thought mostly just about horses, swords, land. The the diplomatic gifts to Baghdad that sent back at the time of Al-Mamun, I don't know, precious silks, exotic animals, mechanical clockwork. The Franks sent horses, sword. This is beautiful, but it's really what they were. And so it's even more beautiful to think that they blended in so well with Romanity. That even if it was already in their veins, was already in that broader Gallo-Roman world where the Franks installed themselves, was already part of the of the Roman legacy in all the West and in more advanced parts. In fact, Western Europe, what we call Western Europe for that reason, in telling the truth, think how how enduring that Roman legacy actually is. Right, the Germans know extremely well that, I don't know, the Rhineland, Bavaria, those were Roman, and you can't see, I don't know, moving 50 kilometers with it, what was not Roman, right? It's a completely different world, or completely, maybe not, but I mean, one where you can really measure the difference that civilizational scale could have even after millennia. Of further achievements, because it's not, again, this is the beautifully vivifying dimension of Romanity. It's not merely something that happened one day. It's something that lived on, that kept living on, kept expanding, kept building on, kept aggrandizing, right, rendering Augustan our Europe. Subsequent diplomatic engagements between Charlemagne and the Eastern, let's say, the Byzantine court, culminated in a compromise that was both formally vague and politically momentous, signaling the defeat that Constantinople had reluctantly acknowledged in practice. In fact, in 1812, the Eastern Emperor acknowledged Charlemagne's imperial status, though refraining from labeling it as Roman, a designation that in its traditional universal sense was preserved according to Byzantine intentions for the Eastern Empire. There are two key aspects of this that really make you think a lot. First of all, as we were saying, the Byzantine had actually ruled Italy, or at least a part of it, up to, well, they kept doing so, especially in the south, but it wasn't a uniform thing. There were still the Longobards in the south, even after the fall of their kingdom in the north. That's also an old story, and it has to do with how this, telling the truth, very similar systems. If you understand, of course, that the Byzantine part of Italy was very Italianized, and of course very similar to the Longobard part. But Ravenna had really been lost a couple of generations before, through a process of relentless decline of Byzantine presence in Italy due to Longobard expansion. So there was all a contentious struggle between the Byzantines and the Longobards. The Longobards had the upper hand on the peninsula since the first half of the 7th century. Literally, the Byzantines at some point, because of the Islamic invasion, everything was collapsed and said, okay, we don't care about this. The Longobards sort of weren't a hyper-militaristic power, just as most Romano-Germanic ones, with the, in fact, exception of the Franks. They had not developed like a... And also the times were very harsh, even for such a rich place like Italy itself, to regain any grandiose plan of reconquest. The Longobards were content with having essentially won the decisive moral majority of the peninsula. That was also very egalitarian in a sense because of the collapse of the latifundium and the majority of the population of the hinterland. Today is probably the Italic stock. The Byzantine presence was mostly confined to the coasts, right, to the ports. And it was fading anyway. So basically, as you know, also the Arabs, anybody knew Italy as Langobardia, right, so Lombardy in practice. However, the Byzantines had kept complaining about having lost, especially Ravenna, that was, as you know, the capital of the Exarchate, and so the most important center that represented its sort of their last deeper connection with an important church that was also antagonistic with Rome in a sense. And that was located, say, not enough in the peninsula to indicate some still specific strategic projection of the Byzantines that was tendentially dreaming of the time in which, at least after the Justinian reconquest, before the Longobards that were invited by the same Byzantines to settle in Italy to counter the Franks, by the way, had the control over the peninsula. So what happened when the Franks take over? There was a lot of diplomatic exchange here. At some point we will see it in fair detail. But what happens here is that here the triad had been normally the Byzantines, the Papacy, and the Longobards. Now when the Franks enter Italy and they start first subjecting the Longobards, then conquering them, because it happened in multiple expeditions, in all of this, none of these players have any word for the Byzantines. Nobody cared. Now that Ravenna was, by the way, conferred to the papacy, because this is exactly what historically happens, that the Franks also augment the papal states, at least nominally, and they take over most of their territory themselves. They do not, let's say, consult Constantinople for establishing a Franco-Roman rule in the peninsula, Franco-Papal if you prefer, right? And so the Byzantines realized that have been completely ousted of the games. Yes, they tried to infiltrate, especially after the Longobard kingdom had been conquered by the Franks, especially in the south. There were many Longobard refugees from the north. They tried to, cause some resistance, maybe to have some coming back, but nothing is really made. I made a video about the Battle of the Livenza River that was mostly like a provincial resistance of the so-called Austrians, that is not the ones of today's Austria, but mostly northeastern Italy. Those were the Longobards who had not sided with the last king Desiderius because they reputed him like a Franco-Papal puppet, and they made their last stand against Charlemagne, who actually was impressed by them and conferred him some autonomy in the process. That's very, very important history, by the way, because all these peoples contributed eventually to the Carolingian conquests, with, especially in the case of the Longobards, with select elite Scare, right, Gazindi. That's kind of a very interesting and important aspect of this whole, and of that same Frankish reverence towards the Longobards, and the generally civilized process through which Italy was conquered. Yes, it was a brutal conquest, like all can be. We know that there was a lot of social shattering that, this was also a consequence of the broader Longobard decline in the last decades of Frankish takeover. The system had been enfeebled by that. But, and of course the Franks established a more brutal, more elite sort of proto-feudal system where individual lords have sort of much greater power, greater strategic reach. Like the Longobards had a sort of more evenly distributed wealth, etc. Very interesting studies by Wickham that describe this. And again, it's because the Franks are the exception, right? You can't even say that, these peoples had different armies. It was just like the degree of professionalism of the Franks. It was greater in greater scale compared to the ones, say, of the Longobards specifically, that were de facto the last also civilized Romano-Germanic people to pertain to that, in fact, more, advanced world. You could put the Anglo-Saxons, but those are lagging a bit behind, more in a northern context, eventually further destabilized by the Norse, their kin, but still, creating problems to the solidity of the same English kingdom as it was about to be formed at some point. This territorial aspect is very important. Never before anybody had conquered Italy. Right? The last had been the Goths. The Longobards had almost taken over the system, but now a complete extirpation, right, of Byzantine presence, even formally, from and probably even the diplomatic landscape. Now, central northern Italy and even parts of the south are Frankish, they are Carolingian. At least there's nothing to do about that, which was also a continuity, as we've seen, of the Longobards legacy in that regional theater, is really a massive blow to the Byzantines. This was a massive defeat of the Byzantines. This is not stressed enough. I've never seen, maybe there are, I'm maybe wrong, but say videos on YouTube stressing how important this moment was in high medieval Europe, and how much the Byzantines were aware of the same as well. Equally, as we observed, the fact that Constantinople recognized an imperial title to Charlemagne, although not the Romanity of the same, is incredibly eloquent. First of all, it is a defeat. And many people will say, oh, well, you see, the Byzantines had somehow a moral upper hand whereby they could say, well, yeah, okay, you're an emperor, but you're not a Roman. As if the Byzantines got it, This is terrible. All right, it's terrible for two reasons. First of all, you're basically recognizing an imperial power to someone. Naturally, it's difficult not to recognize an imperial power to Charlemagne and his empire, because that's de facto an empire, but it's an empire in the properly traditional sense of the imperium, and truly at a scale that is enormous. And it is truly Roman, at least in ambition and broader scope, purpose. But that's where the Byzantines do not want to give up, which is pathetic in a sense, because, while it is understandable that the Byzantines had made of Romanity a bit the hallmark of their international prestige, also against the Arabs, they were known as such in their own, also more eastern dimension, the Pontic, Levantine one, the Eastern Mediterranean, which is objectively a different world from the West. The fact of denying the Romanity of the empire, just as if Romanity and empire could go without one another, especially in a Christian context, right? And one that, if you look at the iconoclasm, was still what was going on at the time of Irene. We made a video about that. There were things that were trying to be restored, etc., and there were great difficulties in the empire still to that. Really made the Byzantines looking like a pretty sorrow mud blippers. Like, you are basically just hanging on surely a regional imperial power in the Eastern Mediterranean that surely has also some footholds in southern Italy, has a broader historical prestige and recognition and a grandeur and civilizational value. So there is no doubt this, but it's fundamentally now being topped by what was up to that point not in theory considered, but what these peoples had been. That is to say, namely subjects, or at least people who had received some kind of imperial delegation from Constantinople. It is rough. It is something which, even on a map, which is not the entire side of the story, but in fact, if you look beyond the map at all the various levels of political, military, and social, like what was occurring in the West was evidently already by the 9th century a revival that the Byzantine Empire could hardly keep up with. The pace of, but not just in again, random terms. Of course, the Byzantines had different pressures. The caliphs were formidable enemies. They also claimed a universal power. The Franks had stopped the Arabs in Aquitaine. There was a general sense that the world was imperiled. It was a moment of an ideal situation, but the might of the Carolingians here, it's something that exceeds also those regional indecisions, like waverings or ambiguities or whatever. Here what has happened is it received the full blessing of Rome, the Holy Herbs. This is an empire that stretches from Brittany to some unprecise part of the middle Danube, it basically doesn't have, which is basically the problem also with Germany later, doesn't have the problem or the actual proof of the upper hand, that doesn't have a real eastern frontier, right? It extends indefinitely, and it reaches, as we've seen, actually pretty far east in terms of broader civilizational reliance from other peoples, even in the Western Eurasian steppes. It has the very finest of Christian Europe in terms of civilization. It has Italy, it has Rome, with all its historical, cultural legacy in deeper sense, from the Church of Rome, her administrative tradition, her important power concentration, her wealth. You have the highly advanced, civilized, literate, urbanized Italy. You have southern Gaul, which is also not bad for that matter. You have the vast resources of the Transalpine world in a broader sense. You have the Rhineland, which is the current center of arms and armor production in Europe. You have the vast agricultural resources of Gaul. You have the, still the sort of brutal frontier of what would become essentially the Eastern Frankish world, but in a relentless advancement, colonization down the Danube, across the Elbe. It's something which really starts hitting hard. I mean, if you look at what the Byzantines were doing, preserving essentially a coastal domain, surely hegemonizing the interland, the adjacent interland that, however, were not as powerfully prestigious as the Carolingian ones. I mean, the Anatolian interland is not this overwhelming explosion of civilization, in case you didn't notice. The Balkans, even less. Southern Italy is rich, but it's also decadent in its, in fact, Byzantine incapacity to further go beyond that coastal dimension. In general, fragmentation in various sort of provinces, districts, that the empire routinely can sort of try to reactivate a more contiguous power from, still having this enormous issues also with the Arabs at sea. So the Carolingians have also a formidable war machine that really has never been seen in terms of broader aptness and relentless attitude to warfare. The Byzantines did fight a lot. They had a very good army. They had their provincial regiments. They had Constantinopolitan forces gaining ever more traction in terms also of further concentration of power in the capital, on the straits. But the Franks really do only war, right? They are gearing up the entire Western Europe for an inclination, let's say, a future proclivity and capacity of further expansion that is literally engineering the entire European backbone, right? This is not just about the Romano-Germanic, as we've seen, administration and order. This is about building on top of that some seigneurial power that is able to hegemonize larger elements of this, and reviving that without, and this is typical of the West, this does not happen in the Byzantine Empire, has already severely declined in that regard, that would actually stimulate autonomies. Cities, I mean, within the seigneury, you have the growth of urban centers, the development of centers all across the system that are mutually interdependent and capable of thriving in an empire that is constituted by multiple kingdoms. This is unheard of in the Byzantine Empire, that paradoxically is the Basileia, ton Roma-Ion. So it's technically a kingdom in and of itself, at least by nomenclature. And that in the West is capable of instead confederating enormous forces into a more unitary direction of continental scale that the Byzantines will not be able to do, for example, with the peoples that they evangelized. All right, those remain other peoples. All right, outside of Byzantine coordination. also the Constantinopolitan Patriarchate direction, they would be sort of civilized, but then they would go on their own. In the West, the empire would not go on its own. Even when national monarchies will rise, there is a general sense that the papacy is at the head of the system. There are the crusades. There's a generally shared cooperation with all this system. You're not enemy to one another other than dynastic issues. There's not a relentless desire of France to destroy Germany or vice versa for the sake of that. This is very underrated. This is an aspect which is truly unique in the history of mankind. So what I said at the beginning of the video concerning the traditionally unitary direction of Europe towards, in fact, a more cohesive imperial power, something that Europe showed consistently in its history. There was always someone trying to hegemonize the system. If you stop from the Middle Ages, you have the Habsburgs, you have the Capetians, still the kings of France, Louis XIV, right? Then you have further, like in less than a century, you have Napoleon, and then you have even for the worse again and any other power that tried to do that as far as the Axis was concerned. Europe has this enormous history of political unification, right? And it's not a unification that failed, again, because we kept living in separated countries. As we are radically cohesive, even in our different tongues, countries, landscapes, looks, food, etc., nobody would think we are something different, right? You would really suspect that the Han Chinese, aside from the meme that they look all alike in the European eyes, are actually more tendentially cohesive people per se, right? Being more subservient does not mean to be more cohesive. You will actually be more cohesive if you are more competitive with one another. This is typical of the West. You can add the United States, you can add, in fact, any other Western power and westernized power to the game, because that's what the West does, right? And that's what actually strengthens the relations. Even in later times, we said it here as the lay and ecclesiastical, like the imperial and papal universal diet was already established. The investiture controversy was an incredible engine of civilization, politically, juridically, literary, even military. At every level, this contrast was never about hating or wanting to annihilate each other, unless we were not deemed to be Western for that matter, like it happened with the Soviet Union, which indeed was a great target to destroy for that matter. In fact, it collapsed for what it was. But actually a stiffening one, a compacting one that further integrated Europe with one another. Again, there is no such thing in the rest of the world. There is no such thing in any other culture of different countries that have done nothing but essentially moving apart from one another as opposed to becoming more cohesive with one another. This is really incredible, and I think it lays literally at the root of what all these various peoples envisaged as part of a broader tradition, and essentially the recognition of imperial power. That's where the Byzantines failed. That's where the Orthodox failed. That's why the Greek Catholics, for example, did not fail. And while instead the other rest of the world was marginalized, right, and was, for example, taken over by the Ottomans, or remained particularly underdeveloped, like in Eastern Europe, this is a completely different thing compared to the rest of the continent. And it's impossible not to see that, especially this broader world that includes also great part of the Slavs, for example, not even the Western Slavs, as we were saying before, because there are eventually, of course, the Ruthenian Palatines, that there is Croatia. Even Bulgaria at some point tried to actually, like, was flirting with the papacy to trigger Constantinople. Then eventually they stuck to the wrong side. Well, I'm sorry for them. There is a guy the other day made a video on medieval Serbia, and he asked me in the comments, why don't you talk about the actual influence that the Catholics had in the forms, for example, of the Italians and the Germans in the development of Serbia. That is instead sort of buying this notion. Again, there are some they are obviously Orthodox. I'm not going to absolutely offend historical truth, because you can be that, right? It's not a crime. But I mean, there is so much about the Western civilization that goes beyond even this nominal device, right? And in fact, that's also something that was meant to be universal. That's why we're talking about this to begin with. Therefore, reflect on simply this disdainful. I do not give you the title of Roman. Well, I have been crowned Roman Emperor by the Pope and acclaimed by the Roman people. Such title. What do I have an empire that is bigger than yours. What do you want more as a Christian and at this point truly Catholic ruler to give you to show that what Romanity actually is? Romanity is which conquers the world, right? Charlemagne, for his part, accepted this deal from his side. I mean, he didn't have to do anything else. It was important, of course, for Constantinople to have recognized at least the imperial designation, which, in his view, conveyed at least a parity with the Byzantine Empire. There is also this notion that Charlemagne was not concerned with the Roman label or its implication of universal authority. This is wrong. Charlemagne was a primitive man, meaning we're talking a Frankish ruler of the 8th century. He would have not been able to conquer the world had it been so primogenially genuine in that broader ethnocultural sense, right? This is a man who knew only how to fight, right? And that yet had the curiosity and the intelligence and the ambition and the striving for this greater conquest that he saw as such, learning how to read and write, right? This is something beautiful, I think. And it speaks volumes about the success of Romanization and more. We could talk a lot about what Charlemagne's psychology would have been, right? But it's very complicated, and normally I don't historically venture on such steps. What we mostly can assess is what we know about the powers of the times and from all the evidence in terms religious, cultural, literary, artistic terms, realizing what they would have believed in from especially such top social position. Charlemagne, as we explained before, lived fully in the wake of that still awakening world, right? Being raised with, the Nibelungenlied and the Gospels is something that makes quite an effect, right? The first time he saw the Pope at Pontion with his father, Pippin the Short, in a context where imagine like this man coming from the south, right? There is also that famous Edda verse, I saw a stag coming from the south, the prime nobility, coming to the hero. That's what essentially the papacy had been witnessed in that context, in requiring the imperium of the Franks to save the Church of Rome in Italy from the ambitions of its neighbors. That was a hotly contested situation in Rome herself, for that matter. But still, the Franks were the ones called to restore that order and to be granted also the sacrality of their Carolingian dynasty, substituting itself with the dying Merovingian one, which was a huge deal because, as we've seen, it's a continuity with that sacred power, the one of Clovis, and that these guys had in their veins, by the way, because they descended themselves through different marriages, through also some Merovingian. But aside from that, Charlemagne accepted a Roman title without needing to pursue that. This is what a true ruler does, right? The Romanity of the empire is something that dawns on you together with the Holy Ghost in the moment in which you have achieved such an enormous empire. Charlemagne was not a guy who would stay there in debating law in diplomatic meetings with the Byzantines and their sophistications. He was a man of war, a man of conquest, a gigantic organizer, right? A logistical titan, veritably. You can't speak of a genius because the art of war of the time would preclude, unfortunately, by scale to have something at least testable as such. There were surely Hannibals and Alexanders also in this time. Charlemagne truly would have been a great candidate, but it's mostly the greatness of the fort, the moral pneuma of his people, and their capacity to remold the world in this new imperial image that was truly Roman in essence. Charlemagne lived by the law which had his free Franks following him in combat without needing to ask their subjection in order to receive it. This is how the system worked. This is how he encountered probably much more resistance than he thought, realizing how tough, after all, these Europeans people really were, right? Heistulf, against at least his father, had really been, quite. He was defeated, and yet he stood back again, and was defeated and fought again and fought again. The Austrian Longobards, as we've seen, were pretty tough. The Saxons, for decades, resisted in their land the efforts of the Franks and their conquest. But this would be the same bloods that would blend together the Carolingian Empire, and that would even be able to maintain the highest standards of the empire and the imperium itself. This would have not been possible without anyone involved. This is not merely a Frankish story, this is a European story, as I was saying since the beginning. Which is also the reason why, by understandable pride, under the influence of papal ideologies, Charlemagne's successors would be prompted to underscore the Roman nature of their empire. This was frankly quite immediate, right? It was immediately understood as something necessary, and now already fully achieved by the same Charlemagne, and therefore unavoidably maintained by his lineage and all those who could achieve that metaphysical status. Yet the practical arrangement between the two imperial courts eventually settled into an unspoken diplomatic accord. They sidestepped their differences in their indirect interactions, while each adhered in their relations with other powers and their subjects to their distinct ideological frameworks. There were different cultures, they had different neighbors on the opposing sides, they had different traditions of rule, they had different mentality. They understood they had, of course, something in common, and the Roman issue, as well as the imperial one, was quite important. But they couldn't also simply be at war all the time, couldn't quarrel at every meeting, right? So there was this actually creeping rivalry that, as you know, would ultimately bring to the victory of the West in quite, harsh ways, and that, in fact, would bring the Byzantine instances to be sidelined by the evidence of the achievements of Western civilization. Remember 1204, not as a date of, again, some sort of crime that was committed, also because the Byzantines called the army themselves to Constantinople, so for their dynastic quarrels. But also because where the Byzantines had arrived, and especially where the Westerners were arrived, were not some random product of some, random bypasser accidentally making crumbling the great universal empire of Rome. It can't be read in that way. While, in fact, it was a Holy Roman Emperor in the West, reaching, by the way, pretty consistent power, and almost, hadn't Henry VI died of illness a decade before, probably would have also witnessed the Germanic recompaction of the East and the West of Europe, the Mediterranean. The concurrent appeal by the Frankish and Greek empires to the Roman heritage encapsulates on an ideological plane the historical truth initially presaged by Clovis's victory in Gaul and later fulfilled by Charlemagne's triumph in Italy, as a veritable Catholic evangelion, not different from the Augustan termination of the Roman civil wars and the conquest of Egypt. And so the perpetuation of this millenary universal tradition of the equality attained between the Latin-Germanic West and the Byzantine East in their efforts to govern, with increasing divergence, in fact, in actual power and quality, the common Mediterranean cultural legacy. And in fact, the rising and outlining Western European one that encompassed part of this, but also other powers that had been a product, in fact, of this Romano-Germanic world. It can't be separated. There is no, speaking of fracture of composition, is not really useful. It's mostly about stressing how any imperial Roman title is founded on unity by definition. Otherwise, it would not be a Catholic universal achievement. And that is where we really leave it at here. And I was really glad to talk about this because we can't talk about very in-depth stuff that may seem a bit too vague sometimes, or at least having a relatively few escape points in terms of broader understanding. Of course, some of the most beautiful videos I've ever made were actually made on very specific topics that enucleated, in fact, from the very within of these stories, how much these broader beliefs were actually maintained. And in fact, that is also a traditional principle, the spark in the heart of men, like a grain, a seed of the dimension of a grain that can really take over the universe, starting from the heart of man, right? Imagine Charlemagne's heart, right, and the empire that he took over. Not bad, right, for the 8th century, not bad for the following history of Europe. It is really difficult to go beyond sometimes, but these bigger videos are exactly designed to make up for it. I don't know how many videos I will make, because usually this is the type of content which reaches for the stars, but I'm not sure really. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. It's a powerful video with a powerful title. Most people do not really grasp the intensity of the other content, right? They're sometimes baited by what are not supposed to be bait, even, where I really stick to the basic objectivity, even in the titles. I never make a title that talks about something that it's really not going to be about, right? But I think that in general, videos like these are definitely helpful, and if they can expand a broader horizon, let's say, for the understanding of foundational principles that eventually you can find also in smaller topics, well, mission accomplished, right? I really invite you to watch other videos. For example, it struck me how the other day I made fair amount of views, but the other day, for example, I made that video on, what was it? Frederick II's siege of Rome. That was a very important video. People didn't sort of watch it that much, not even the one on the history of medievalistics. I mean, these are important topics. Now I will continue. Probably if this video will boom in the next day, I will make much more, like I made the second video on medievalistics, because again, you need to also connect as a Pavlovian reflex, which doesn't mean that I'm treating you like dogs, because that reflex, as you know, was eventually tested and demonstrated on humans as well. But you have to habituate yourself to associate this type of content as an homogeneous one with the others. It's not like I talk about this today and tomorrow it's another story. You understand that this is all one with the explanation that I just provided regarding the unitary value of European tradition. So let's make this imperial endeavor work, which seems to me quite appropriate given the circumstances. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.